we're actually not depending on magic. We're not depending on a quantum leap. We actually know how to get to net zero on a step-by-step basis starting right now. And that, I think, should give us great confidence. This isn't about, again, magic in 2040. This is about reality today and following a very clear step-by-step. We got to hustle. We got to work fast. We have to do it at pace. But we actually know the steps to get from here to there.
Welcome to this special English edition of Der große Neustart, a German podcast series by Sibylle Barden, in which she talks to pioneering leaders who, inspired by the World Economic Forum's Great Reset initiative, are committed to making our world smarter, greener, and fairer.
Today, I'm very excited to welcome MedWatchers, Chief Executive Officer of the Mission Possible Partnership. MPP is an alliance of climate leaders focused on supercharging decarbonisation across the entire value chain of the world's highest emitting industries in the next 10 years. Concrete, steel, aluminium, and chemicals, as well as ships, planes, and trucks that move them, are the building blocks of the global economy. These 7 sectors are currently responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. MPP wants to radically change it and reach net zero by 2050. A very warm welcome to MedWatchers in San Francisco, MPP's chief executive. And only recently has he been appointed to run this wonderful organization. Congratulations. Mr. Rogers, how hopeful are you to reach this ambitious target?
Good morning, and thank you for that very kind introduction. You find me in week 7 of this role, and I am very hopeful that, in fact, we can achieve net zero by 2050. The time is now. The technology is in place for many of these sectors to start moving now. The commitments are in place from major companies to make this work starting now. And the demand side, interestingly, the demand pull for many of these energy transitions is coming on very, very strong. And so we have the opportunity across these 7 industrial sectors to deliver ahead of schedule if we put our minds to it starting now.
That sounds fantastic. Let's start at the beginning with MPP and its 4 core partners. Who are they, and why did they get together, and what's your main goal?
Well, the goal is very straightforward, which is net zero by 2050 across these 7 industrial sectors. 4 organizations came together to form the Mission Possible Partnership a little more than a year ago. The Energy Transitions Commission actually wrote the initial Mission Possible report back in 2018, and they've been essential for developing a set of the sector transition strategies for each of these 7 sectors. The World Economic Forum, the second partner in this coalition, drove a set of very early convenings on this and has been central to driving convenings in each of the 7 sectors in transport and materials. They've also put together things like the First Movers Coalition to really help accelerate the demand side of this. They've been involved in financing the energy transition. They're doing industrial clusters now in some good ways. We Mean Business brings together some of the most ambitious companies, and the commitments that the We Mean Business Coalition made quite early were really foundational for moving this along. They have been early in taking action. They've had some of the first buyers clubs for buying net zero products. They've been very articulate on policy and the policy actions that are required to make this happen, and on accountability on how you get science-based targets. The RMI has been doing a lot on industrial decarbonization. They've have a whole climate-aligned industries program. They've been quite active in the US, in China, in India. Their Center for Climate-Aligned Finance has been important for what MPP is doing. And we have support from a lot of other institutions as well, including the folks at Breakthrough Energy, the Bezos Earth Fund, Bloomberg, and many others. And the core to it was this coalition recognized that the time was now. And if we put our resources together, if we created a coalition of coalitions, it would help accelerate and catalyze more projects more quickly. And so that's why the group came together.
I also saw the Bezos Foundation and Bloomberg, and I think the European Climate Foundation. So it's really a massive network that you run here.
Indeed, it's a broad network, and again, the role of MPP is to connect the dots, to link the pieces together, to connect all of the great innovations that's going on in different parts of each of these coalition partners, and make the sum of the project 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 5, and enables us to have substantially more impact by working together than if we each operated in our own little silos. This problem is too big for any one to take on, and so we're trying to do that by making sure this coalition is coherent and acts in concert and really moves this forward at pace.
Yeah, and from what I see, it's cross-sector, cross-country, cross basically everything.
Cross-sector, and some of the things that we're finding are helpful are if you work across the 7 sectors. There are things like these industrial clusters that come together in ways that no one individual sector or one individual company could lift, but across the 7 sectors, you can get it done. The same thing on a set of policy imperatives. Things like each of these 7 sectors depends heavily on clean hydrogen coming into the economy. And yet that's probably not the number one goal for any one sector. But if you do the sum across, it ends up being quite important. And so these 7 sectors, along with these set of coalition partners together, can simplify some of these things for policymakers around the world and make some of these things happen more easily.
Yeah. If we look at the status quo, we have, after the power sector, heavy industries is the second largest source of CO2 emissions, accounting for 27% of all CO2 emissions worldwide. And your organization states on its site that the 4 materials, basically steel, cement, aluminium, and chemicals, are responsible for 60% of current industry emissions. Where do you begin with your massive task?
You frame it correctly. It's almost 30% of global emissions, and it's growing. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But we begin from a process standpoint. We're following a relatively straightforward process to get to action. We start with convening. We bring the most ambitious leaders in the industry together. We then move to developing these sector transition strategies, these roadmaps that are operationally relevant and actionable. We then move to commitments, and most of the companies that we're involved in are making very bold commitments on decarbonization and following these roadmaps. And then we move to action. And what's fascinating is the time for action. If you look at, we need to get to 2050 and we start moving from right to left, we actually have to start action now in order to have a shot at getting to 2050 on pace. Interestingly, the key unlock and the thing that is most striking about the market today is how business is leading from the demand side, is pulling forward a set of these transitions. And so this demand side unlock is key to acting quickly. And again, the good news is there are some places in the world where the demand, the supply, the policy environment, infrastructure, and finance can actually align today to move a set of these projects forward. And again, these are some of these industrial clusters. And then again, some ambitious companies are really out there with Lighthouse projects now.
Yeah. And maybe you can talk a bit about the Lighthouse projects. Can you give us an example of, for example, how do you decarbonize an entire shipping industry? Can you talk us through it a little?
Yeah, so shipping is a great example. Shipping is hard. This is a very difficult to decarbonize sector, but the industry has been in the lead for some time in working through this. We have the as part of our coalition, we have the Global Maritime Forum as a active core leader in making this happen. And so they're ahead of the game. So what are the key parts of making this happen? They put together the Poseidon Principles a couple of years ago, which was about how do we finance the transition. They put together the Clydebank Declaration for COP26, which defined a set of these green shipping corridors. So where do we start? We start with a set of point-to-point, port-to-port places where we're going to decarbonize shipping. Interestingly, what underlies that then is a set of demand signals, a set of shippers who in fact want to make sure that their product is carried across the oceans on net zero ships. And so we have a very strong demand signal from a set of the large shippers around the world. We are getting now to a point where we understand the supply side of the equation. How do we get net zero fuels? Things like ammonia, things like methanol. How do we make net zero ships work? The good news, again, is we've known that this can work in Europe for some time. And so now we're beginning to think through how we apply that on the high seas. And then we go to things like the policy environment, and the International Maritime Organization, IMO, has been quite thoughtful about how you set regulations for ships around the world, and their safety principles matter, and their carbon intensity principles matter as well. And then we're going to have to figure out the supply chain and how do we get more net zero ships on the ocean as quickly as possible. And that's building a set of ships and retrofitting a set of ships is going to take some time, but we actually know how to do it even today.
And you were mentioning it's a big industry. How willing is the industry overall?
The industry is very committed to this idea of net zero and getting to 2050. And they've been working it as an industry group for a good period of time. They have a good alignment with a global regulator in the IMO. They have a set of good technology innovations going on. So the industry has been quite committed to this. And again, the shippers who work with this industry, who move product around the world, are very committed to this. And if you can get a committed industry and a committed demand side, that usually moves you a long way forward to make these industries work.
Yeah. Coming back to the 7 sectors transitions, what are the goals for each of the sectors?
So the goal, the core goal, net zero by 2050, we've put together a set of sector transition strategies that lead us to 2050 on a step-by-step pathway. Where do you need to be by 2025? Where do you need by 2030? How do you get to 2050? What does that look like? And the industry is endorsing those transition strategies. We'd like to be in places where we're getting 50% down by 2030, and many of these industries getting to 20% down by 2030 is going to be a real effort, and I think we are going to get there. But the key is now we've begun to define it into a set of operational priorities. So how many plants need to be built by what point in time? What does that mean in terms of getting those plants started, because there's a long lead time to making a set of these happen. And by breaking it down into these blocks and by making it operationally relevant, all of a sudden now the organizations can get to work. The most ambitious companies can get to work. And when everybody sees what the transition pathway looks like, it makes it much easier to drive capital formation. And I think that's the measure, the marker, the so-called GFANs, the global financial system coming together for net zero is committed $4.16 trillion to funding this kind of transition. Yeah. Our task is to make sure that they know how much capital is needed, where and when. And that, I think, is the process that we're on right now.
Yeah. Can I just go in there? And how do you know where the capital is needed most?
Well, we know how many plants are needed, and is the sort of the first marker of that. So we know how much capital we need in each block, and again, working with the financial providers so that we have a shared view of what that looks like is part of what the Mission Possible Partnership is about, just to create that kind of transparency in the system. So I think that's kind of the first block of it. And then what's fascinating is to begin to look for places where this can work. There's one of the green corridors for shipping, if we just take that as an example, that the shipping world has defined as the Shanghai to Los Angeles corridor. It has a set of highly concentrated demand of shippers who want to make sure that they have net zero shipping. You have a great port in Shanghai, a great port in Los Angeles. And the question now is, how do I put the infrastructure on both ends of that in order to make that work? Some of that's hard infrastructure. How do I create green ammonia in a place like Los Angeles and really make that a successful place to dock? Some of it can be things like soft infrastructure. So there are conversations around, can we get net zero berths in harbors? Because a berthing slot is among the most valuable places in the world. And so how do we create the capacity to make that a really easy transit to make for a green ship, much as we've done with EV lanes on roads, right? Can we do the same thing with soft infrastructure in shipping? And though if you combine a set of physical infrastructure that delivers fuels, soft infrastructure that enables the speed of change, and then a set of the committed shippers and committed ship owners, this you can decarbonize something like that in a very finite period of time.
Yeah, because you mentioned Shanghai and Los Angeles, is it an obstacle that we talk about the US and China, or is it absolutely cross-country here?
It has to be a global story because, in fact, all of these industries that we're talking about in different ways are quite global in scope. And so we're not going to achieve net zero by 2050. We're not going to achieve 20% down even by 2030 unless we have a real global commitment to make this happen. And again, I think coming out of COP, there's that clear global commitment. But it's going to occur in specific places, right? This isn't at this point in time, this is not some global macro piece. It's about how do we get the port of Shanghai and the port of LA to work? How do we get the port of Fujairah in the Middle East to decarbonize? Because a lot of the ships from Asia to Europe end up going through that location. How do we get the port of Rio and the port of Rotterdam to decarbonize? It's going to be in places where the world is going to make that kind of shift.
Yeah. So, and how do you generate commitments then for net zero? Do your partners need proof for the zero carbon value chains that it works, or do they know already?
So, the good news is we have some 400 partner companies already involved in the Mission Possible Partnership, and that continues to grow in terms of companies that are committed to net zero and are committed to figuring out how to make this work. A part of it is about confidence, and it starts with ambition, and you have a set of CEOs who are quite ambitious and who are committed to the targets. Yeah. Part of it's about confidence and building confidence in their teams that there really is a operationally relevant sector transition strategy that everybody can look at and understand and figure out, and the bankers can look at it and the engineers can look at it and stack hands and say, yeah, we can actually get that done. And then part of it's about making sure that there is a focus on we can pull all the different elements to make this work. We can talk about it some more in a minute, but you need to get new plants up. You need to improve energy efficiency. You need to get the policymakers and the infrastructure aligned. So it's about getting the whole alignment end to end to make this work. And again, if everybody has the same sort of roadmap and transition strategy to make this happen, then I think that's the way to get that alignment moving quickly.
Yeah. Is your experience that when you talk about your 400 partners, that the leaders in the sectors are more able, more willing than, let's say, a small or mid-size company?
I wouldn't say it's driven by size. I think it's in the first instance, it's driven by ambition of the leaders, and so we have large companies and mid-sized companies. We have small companies involved, and that indeed, in some ways, it's the mix of companies because they come at it from different angles and they have different kinds of questions. And the mix creates that richness, and in some ways, it creates the speed of change because a smaller company may say we can make that shift more quickly, and that ends up being a really rich part of the dialogue. So it is led by the most ambitious, and that doesn't mean everybody's there yet, but it does mean that there is a big enough block of the demand, of the supply side and of the demand side, that are very ambitious that we can get moving today.
Yeah. So now we have the net zero by 2050, which is a massively ambitious target. And at the same time, we live in a world where demand is only about to increase. And of course, with it, the emissions. Can you take us through your strategy? Because you obviously keep it in mind. How do you handle that?
Yeah. So each of the sector transition strategies addresses demand up front and squarely, because if you look across these industrial sectors, these sectors are very important to global economic growth and to resilience, right? As we look forward, we depend on these sectors to be successful economically and from a resilience standpoint. So we need to really understand the growth side of the equation. Growth is central to the mapping. Interestingly, part of it obviously is about feeding growth with net zero fuels, for example, and how do we make growth net zero? That's kind of the first thing we can do across sectors. It's the first thing, interestingly, that the power sector did, was it made growth net zero. We're in the same bucket of let's start by making growth net zero, and that is part of levelizing things out. Then let's figure out how to get a lot more of the clean fuels into the system in many of these, or clean feedstocks into the system to make that work. And that's things like hydrogen, it's things like biofuels. As we work through the assessment, it's things like renewable energy for many of these sectors. And so we have to make that transition as well. And then we actually do have to think about efficiency, even in things like, cement is a core part of concrete, and yet the blending rates vary dramatically around the world. And in many places, we use too much cement in our concrete that's not necessary in order to make sure it's safe. And so making sure that we have the right kinds of efficiency measures in each of these different sectors is also an important part of this. One of the things in aviation are assumptions about how much efficiency can be introduced into the airplane fleet as we move through time. And so energy efficiency and efficiency in blending really does matter as we look forward, if we hope to meet any of these goals in a market that is growing over time.
Yeah. Because you mentioned concrete early on. During my research, I saw that concrete is the second most used material on Earth. That is, to turn that into net zero is... you have not an easy task. It's not an easy task,
though. Again, the Global Concrete and Cement Association has been a core partner in making this happen. They are deeply engaged in what the process is for decarbonization. They operate, in every country in the world. This is a technology that, in some ways, was invented by the Romans and have been perfected over time. It's very remarkably inexpensive, a core part of both growth and resilience in many economies. And so it's a key element. You can't move it very far. It's very heavy. And so how do we make decarbonization happen in every place around the world is a core part of their task. And they're working great at making that happen.
Yeah. My next question is more a question for the business community who actually hopefully listens to it and thinks, well, yeah, but what does it mean for me, for example? If we go back to the 7 sectors, and I just repeat them again: aluminium, chemicals, concrete, steel, the aviation industry, shipping, and trucking. What steps are required until 2030 and 2050 to net zero? And maybe you can use an example or two.
So maybe we'll take a couple examples. Let's do aviation, because that's one that businesses all around the world get to deal with as passengers, and the industry is very committed to driving to net zero. So what does aviation require? It requires things. One of the great things about aviation is for many of the applications, we can actually blend down the carbon intensity of jet fuel over time. And so we can follow a stepwise path of decarbonization that works well. And we have a competition across biofuels, so-called HEFA. We have alcohol to jet. So how do you turn things like ethanol into jet fuel? We have now a whole set of things, so-called power to jet or power to liquids, which is about how do I turn hydrogen into jet fuel. And you have competition from pure hydrogen players and pure electric players in the industry. And so the competition among the different decarbonization pathways and which kinds of routes are amenable to which kinds of solutions is one of those things that allows decarbonization to happen more quickly. We also know that we can make the carbon intensity of jet fuel, just as it's made in refineries, substantially lower in its emissions. And so how do we add that into the mix? But the ability to begin to drive down, from something today that looks like 90 grams of CO2 per megajoule of jet fuel, down to 80 to 70, down to 50. How do we make that process work is what the task is at hand. One of the great things in the aviation sector is that the demand signals are very strong. There are a set of large passenger groups, let's call them big companies, that move their people around the world, who are very committed to net zero, and as part of the First Movers Coalition and other things have made commitments to buying airplane tickets that are net zero, and how do we link that then to the fuel demand ends up being part of the equation. The good news again, the airlines are already buying, they're already flying with net zero jet fuel. And I think what we're seeing now is how do you scale that industry over time? How do you get the infrastructure in place? How do you make sure the policy's in place? Because what we need by 2030 are 300 to 400 net zero jet fuel plants in the world. And we need to get that to essentially 100% of the industry by 2050. So we've got a ways to go, but we actually know how to get there. We know the pieces to get from here to there.
Yeah. It's really, it's fantastic too when one dives into that whole subject, how fast the industries move on after they have decided that they want to move on. And I've been recently at the ESG Global, where we talked about it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and still you have so many companies who hear that for the first time. Do you have the same experience? That you find leaders where you think they are not anywhere near?
There are the number of leaders who are not near is growing smaller by the day, and I think both because as we look at things coming out of COP, there was such strong business leadership and business commitment. I do think it's important to recognize how much business is leading the way. Part of the equation here is business is leading, and then governments are following with the policies that are necessary to make that happen. And that kind of what I think that we mean business folks call an ambition cycle is turning out to be very powerful in this arena. Certainly, there are some folks who either can't or don't want to make this transition, but the rate of change and the scale of change is very high, and it's amazing what happens when the demand side of the equation says, "This is what I want you to do." the change happens relatively quickly. I mean, one of the ones that was instructive for me was to look at the amount of investment in trucking, in renewable diesel fuel in the United States, as a simple example, over the last couple of years has been in the double-digit billions now. Over 10 billion has been committed, and it's been committed in part because the big shippers, the companies that use trucks, said we need to see renewable diesel in the market, and it started in California, and then it spread to the California plus 10, and now it's spreading beyond that. And so when the demand side says this is what we want you to do on the supply side, again, whether it's a services supply like trucking or whether it's a fuel supply, all of a sudden, things happen relatively quickly. And that's why, again, this demand side signal is so important in the market.
Yeah. Coming from America, it always sounds so simple. It sounds like, hey, let's make it happen. And then we make it happen. Still, are there any major obstacles and barriers to change you see when you have your multi-stakeholder approach? Let's say it's corporations, government, civil society. Is there, I don't know, for example, a knowledge barrier or a mindset problem? Do you see any of that?
I think we've moved in most cases beyond mindset. We're trying in many ways to bridge the knowledge gap and to create great transparency and visibility into the kind of transitions that are underway and how to make that happen. I think we're now into the obstacles that are, let's call it operational obstacles. We have supply chain issues. There are more orders for electric trucks right now than the truck manufacturers can produce. And so, how do we make that kind of supply chain work in the right way? There's more demand for net zero airplane seats than there is net zero fuel in the market today, right? So we have a supply chain question that we have to drive. There are a set of policy issues. Interestingly, again, some of the most boring and basic things like siting and permitting. We need to be able to site and permit plants much more quickly if we want to meet the kind of growth rate and, again, in things like aviation fuels in order to make that work. And sometimes, again, it's basic infrastructure, like how do we make sure that there's enough hydrogen or CO2 pipelines around? Those kinds of things are the barriers that are most pronounced right now. There are going to be others as we go through this, but in terms of getting started, it's some of the really basic things that we need to make sure are in place in order to move this at an appropriate pace over time.
Mm-hmm. Let's come to a more broader section where we talk about how to rethink and reframe business models. But before, it's very important that we know where you come from and to see what's possible. So you basically have spent 35 years serving energy clients around the world. You were establishing strategic priorities to win in the energy transition, shaping capital investments, defining policy approaches, driving operational improvement programs, and building capabilities to accelerate growth. You also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Energy, and I think that was during the Obama years, and worked for McKinsey. So you have really a huge amount of experience. So looking broader at business models, we do have to move on altogether. So how do we rethink and reframe them?
So, I had the privilege of serving clients in 35 different countries around the world. I had, again, the privilege of serving the U.S. government, serving power companies and oil companies and technology companies in the energy sector. And what's fascinating as you look across that suite are things like, if you just take a simple model like business models, the ability of companies to make transitions, to pivot in a new direction, it can actually be quite high. I mean, if you want the most recent example, the pandemic highlighted just how nimble companies can be to move from in the office to working from home in a very short period of time, to move from in-person to digital kinds of sales processes. Just the ability to make that kind of change that quickly is a core part of what great leaders do in great companies. And I think we have many more great examples in that transition over the last couple of years. And so we're looking for that same kind of leadership here, and we're seeing that same kind of leadership here. And that's the good part. So what does it take? It takes really understanding what the opportunity is in the marketplace. And again, this goes back to understanding, if my customer wants me to do something different, I'm going to figure out how to do that pretty quickly, because these companies have great engineers, they have great marketing people, they have great finance people. And so we have the ability now to say, okay, here is where the market is going. If I'll take the jet fuel example, we know now what kind of carbon intensity of jet fuel I need to match for every 5 years as we go between now and 2050. So how do I, as a company, as a supplier, as a buyer, as a passenger, how do I adjust in order to meet that kind of pathway? Because once I know what the roadmap is, now it's a process of operations to make that happen. So the first block is, it's about agility, and companies are great at doing that. The second block is, this is about, we are making a move towards a block of capital formation. And again, the opportunity is, the companies that are out front in making some of those changes happen are right now experiencing advantage from doing that. And once companies begin to understand where their source of advantage is, the capital and the business model follows, I think, relatively quickly. Again, the good news is the technology is there to make a lot of this happen. We still need some more technology innovations in some places, but we have we could have all the technology we need to get between now and 2030. And the rate of innovation in technology is super fast right now. And so I have no question that we'll have all the technologies we need to get to 2050. So, again, there are relatively few barriers once I get the right market signals in place.
We are also in the middle of a systemic change, because if we think back, and my conversation with Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, he basically talked about that Milton Friedman said in the 70s that the business of business is business, and this kind of mantra took us basically up until probably the global financial crisis and a little longer. If you look at that mantra now, where do you think we are right now?
Well, I think we are now understanding that things like greenhouse gas emissions or particulate emissions are, a part of any business equation. Businesses have, if we go all the way back, businesses haven't, polluting has not exactly been a profitable enterprise for a long time. For the short time, you can take advantage of the tragedy of the commons, but for the long period, there's a real recognition that doesn't actually work as a core business model. And I think as we look forward here, there is a great understanding of, how do I integrate carbon intensity? How do I integrate carbon emissions and put a price on carbon in my core operations? One of the challenges, as you were describing with businesses, is once I understand what the challenge is, I then can operationally make the shift. And I think we now have most companies in the process of having made the shift in terms of really understanding the role that carbon emissions play in the business world and in business models. And they now have the tools to actually make that part of their day-to-day operations. And when that happens, a whole lot of things are possible. I think, look, the other big push, by the way, in this whole arena is what your investors are saying, right? We talked a lot about the demand side. If your investors say, we need you to decarbonize more quickly, that's a pretty good signal for a CEO to take action. And we're seeing that in spades.
Yeah. And talking about investors, what do you think has Larry Fink's letter to the CEOs, what kind of an impact was that we want now stakeholder capitalism and ESG is the new gold standard? Did that help a bit?
Larry Fink's letter was important. In my former world, one of the things that effectively Larry's letter said was, we're going to start by only investing. We can't divest. These companies are too important for global growth, but we're only going to invest in the top half of any given sector. One of the great parts in my former world was the number of phone calls we got from multiple sectors was, so where is half? Like, am I in the top half or in the bottom half right now? And so it was a great, and so again, this goes back to what do companies know and what do companies understand? It's like, well, so I need to know where I am. Am I in the top half or in the bottom half? So once people figure that out, then it's like, so what does it take to me to get from the bottom half into the top half? And now we have a race, and the race is terrific. Because in multiple sectors, once you get a race going on with the folks in the bottom half trying to get into the top half, you know what happens? The mean, the halfway point, gets better and better and better. And that's what we're in the middle of right now is that race to see who can actually get better fast enough to keep ahead of what the investors want. And it does allow us then to focus on, how do we accelerate? There are a set of companies in each of these sectors that are doing great things. How do we double down on some of those, even as we encourage a set of, brown to greener transitions from folks who were not as well positioned, but who are now in a real hurry to catch up. And that kind of competitive dynamic is enormously powerful in driving decarbonization.
Yeah. How important is collaboration in the whole transition?
Yeah, collaboration is key. Collaboration is key on, we just talked about how competition is really important. Collaboration is also important. And interesting is things like collaboration along the value chain. So how do I make sure that a green steel plant, for example, has enough hydrogen feedstock and enough offtake into the auto sector in order to make the end-to-end economics work, right? That kind of value chain collaboration ends up being quite important. And I think we can see that across these, how do we get the passengers who want net zero seats to work with the airlines, because the airlines are then working with the sustainable aviation fuel providers. That, how do we get the shippers who want net zero trucks to work with the trucking firms, to work with the fuel suppliers, and then frankly, to work with some of the truck manufacturers to make sure that the supply chain comes together quickly enough, because that's the, getting that collaboration ends up being quite a challenge. But if we can get that value chain to work and step together into the next level of decarbonization, boy, the results can happen quite quickly.
Yeah. And how quick would an organization like yours be able to put them together on a table? Let's say you have a new aim and you want to quickly bring together a big shipping contractor and the bank and this and that. How fast can you bring them together?
The good news is they're coming together now, and they're going to come together at two different levels. One level of collaboration is going to be very, very local. We're going to go to a set of places, these so-called industrial clusters. There are a set of places in the world where these value chains need to come together, and it's not something that's mega galactic. It's something that's, very, very local. It's, again, how do I decarbonize the port of Los Angeles? How do I decarbonize the port of Houston or the port of Chicago? Right? How do I make those places work? Yeah. And that kind of collaboration is a very local event. There's a few players who have to come together. There's a few fuel suppliers, a few shippers, a few banks. And some local policymakers that can come together to make that happen. Then there's a set of collaboration that needs to happen at a higher level so that we get consistent blend standards for airplanes, and that airplanes that leave one place and come to another place, we have common standards that make that work. And that's getting policymakers together, again, with industry players, together with some of the technology players, to make sure that all, and of course the finance people, and make sure that all the pieces come together at the top level to create the architecture, and at the local level. And so we're going to be working at both of those levels in order to make this happen.
Yeah. Can I ask you, how do you finance all this change when you bring them all together? Is that the major issue, or does it come later?
Financing is a super important question, and again, the Global Financial Alliance for NetZero is doing and we're spending time with them to make sure that the roadmaps that we've put together align with the roadmaps that they're putting together, because we want to make sure that the dollars follow the decarbonization curves that need to take place, and follow the plants that need to get built to make that happen. What we're spending time doing, and there are a couple of good efforts underway to basically figure out how do we model that end-to-end value chain. There was a good piece out recently that basically said, we're talking about, if I go to a net zero car, that is a physical car, not what the fuel it runs on, but net zero for the manufacturing, that's probably going to cost something like, maybe a 5% increase in the cost of the car. How do I and then I've got a hydrogen plant and I've got a steel plant. How do I make sure that all of the economics across that end up working? How does it work for the consumer? How does it work for the steel plant? How does it work for the hydrogen plant? Again, the good news is that with the right kind of place in the world where hydrogen is inexpensive, for example, and the right kind of policy environment where there's encouragement for things like hydrogen, there's encouragement for net zero cars or net zero steel, all of a sudden you can make those economics close in key places today. And what we're trying to do is let's find a set of places where it works today, and let's scale those up. And then there are going to be a whole nother set of places that will quickly follow on in making that happen. But getting the bankers and the finance providers as part of these value chain collaborations is an essential part of being successful here.
Yeah. Coming from finance to policymakers, to governments, what is their role in it, and do they need to step up, perhaps?
So the governments have a critical role to play. Again, business has been leading in important ways. Government started leading. Now business is leading. It's a good ambition cycle to make that work. Governments are important in two or three ways. One are just as we talked earlier, the basic operational ways. Siting and permitting, making sure that new projects can get built. Because if it takes us 10 years to site and permit a new plant, our path to 2050 doesn't work, right? That's just quite clear. And that ends up in many cases being a local kind of process. It's important for governments to be involved in creating a level playing field. Interestingly, there are incentives, for example, for diesel fuel and for jet fuel are different in different markets. And that leads to flows of resources going in different pathways that can be distorting to markets. And so how do governments create that kind of level playing field? Things like blend standards are ways to create consistency across that. So creating clear incentives for markets that have some duration in time matters. A 2-year incentive isn't very helpful. A 10-year incentive is fully monetizable. How do we make that work? So I think those are the kind of things that governments need to do. And the good part, again, about where we are today now is I think we have industry in many cases aligned with what those kinds of government roles need to be. It isn't some, super complicated piece. They're just a set of basic building blocks that governments can put in place that will make these projects happen more quickly. And then we'll get the right kind of pull going through the marketplace.
Yeah. Just before we come to our last question, because you mentioned standards, and we see already new standard boards being created, and we have them in the US and we have them in Europe and probably in Asia. Is that helpful to have these different standard boards, or should we have just one?
Well, we need to get to a consistent set of standards. Again, businesses operate really well when there's a consistent set of standards. If they're inconsistent, then it creates costs and complexity, and it slows things down. So in general, we want to converge towards a common set of standards. Standards help a lot. And if we have, if we understand where we're going on decarbonization, and there's a set of standards about what does green steel really mean, or what does net zero steel look like? What does low carbon cement look like, or low carbon concrete? What does that look like? If we can get clear on that, then, by the way, we all of a sudden allow buyers to make sound choices in the marketplace. One of the most powerful groups today, one of the most important groups in the market today, are people like the chief procurement officers from many companies. And if we give them real standards by which to buy, they're very, very good at understanding it. Let's call it a quality differential between two products. And so if we know and we can label every ton of steel and every ton of aluminum and every airplane flight with what its carbon intensity is, then procurement officers can make that kind of decision, because that's part of what they do every day. But without standards, we're asking that, they have a hard job, and we're asking them to make sort of standards choices that are in a very murky world. So standards matter, getting consistency matters, and that will help accelerate, good standards will help accelerate the development of these markets.
Yeah, and you don't see a problem that they have different standard setting and creating more obstacles than necessary?
In general, I think what we're seeing in many places is competition, and competition in general is a useful thing. We're going to see, things like SBTI are important, right? We need a sort of set of science-based targets to make that happen. But how we turn that into labeling requirements, for example, I think we're going to see multiple different lenses, but I think we'll actually converge relatively quickly in terms of what that looks like. If we end up with radically different standards around the world, that's going to be a problem. But I think if the competition among standard setters right now, I think will just help create more information in the marketplace, and then we can drive to convergence over the sort of the one magic standard. I think competition will lead to a better result more quickly.
The UN calls our time the Great Transformation. The World Economic Forum called it the Great Reset. And we have entered already the fourth industrial revolution. So from everything you were talking about today, do you think we have passed the time for incremental steps and are now left with one solution only, basically a quantum leap?
One of I wrote a book called Resource Revolution in 2014, and argued that this was the most interesting time in 100 years. And I still believe that that's true, because the rate of change is so fast. But on the other hand, that gives me great confidence that we're actually not sort of depending on magic. We're not depending on a quantum leap. We actually know how to get to net zero on a step-by-step basis starting right now. And that, I think, should give us great confidence. This isn't about, again, magic in 2040. This is about reality today and following a very clear step-by-step. We got to hustle. We got to work fast. We have to do it at pace. But we actually know the steps to get from here to there. We do, in fact, hope for, and we are looking forward to a set of quantum breakthroughs, because that will help accelerate and make sure that we don't miss at the end. But between now and 2030, it's just hard work. It's just step by step. When we get into that next period, then hopefully we get things like fusion. Hopefully we get, which, by the way, has gone from a 20-year project to maybe it's a 10-year project now, and tribute to the innovators who've been driving that kind of change. We're seeing great innovations that could, in fact, make it easier to get to 2050, but we can get there right now with hard work. And I think that's what should give everyone a great degree of confidence that now's the time to take action, and we know how to get there step by step.
Mm-hmm. Well, listening to you gives me great confidence that we can do it, but what happens if we are not doing it, if we fail?
Well, I think I start with the view that we won't fail. The global economy knows how to do this kind of work. It's not rocket science, to use the old expression. It's just hard work, and we know how to do hard work. We know the ability of businesses to pivot and make this happen. We should have great confidence in. So I start with we won't fail. Look, there's a set of things that we need to do on resilience too. We need to make the global economy more resilient against the state of climate change that we're already seeing, right? The amount of storms and floods, fires, and where I live end up being, quite profound even today. And we need to make investments in order to protect ourselves against those protect the economy against those kind of situations. So investing in resilience is a necessary element of where we stand even today. But the time is now to make a set of investments on the path to net zero. We know how to get to 2050. We know what we have to do by 2030. And so, I think if we make investments in resilience and we hustle up and really get to pace on the decarbonization, the global economy will be in very good shape as we move forward.
Well, that sounds really fantastic. And I'm really, really grateful that you found the time to talk to us. It was there were many, many insights. And it was an absolutely fantastic interview. Thank you very much, MedWatchers, to San Francisco. And and good luck and lots of energy for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the time today.
You've been listening to a special English edition of Der große Neustart, a German podcast series by Sibylle Barden, in which she talks to pioneering leaders who are committed to making our world smarter, greener, and fairer. For more information, please visit www.sibyllebarden.com and the official site of the World Economic Forum.